We must have heard several names in our daily lives, such as black gold, crude oil, or petroleum, and they all refer to a thick, black, flammable liquid that resides underground. It's oil. Oil does not come from dinosaurs. It's a persistent myth and one I get asked about often. You may have heard this idea in school, read it in books, or taken it to heart from educated people talking about the nature of our planet. But how did this misconception arise? It's hard to know. People have been thinking about oil for a long time. Oil, tar, and asphalt were known to our pre-industrial ancestors, and they used them in limited ways. 2,000 years ago, the Chinese in Sichuan drilled for oil and natural gas using pieces of iron connected to bamboo pipes. The gas was directed through bamboo channels into homes where it provided heat and lighting. In the 8th century, the streets of ancient Baghdad were paved with natural asphalt. Petroleum tar has long been used to seal the wooden hulls of ships. The idea that dinosaurs were the source of petroleum or crude oil is completely fictional. Oil was formed from the remains of marine plants and animals that lived before the dinosaurs, a very long time before the period in which dinosaurs were supposed to exist. After these small organic organisms fell to the bottom of the sea, bacterial decomposition removed most of the oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur from its structure, leaving behind a sludge composed mainly of carbon and hydrogen. Then the decomposition process gradually slowed down as oxygen was removed from these remains, and over time these remains became covered with layers of sand and silt, and the more layers there were, the greater the pressure and heat exerted on them. Even when the organic remains were at a depth of 10,000 feet or more, the heat and pressure exerted on them by the layers were sufficient to change the chemical compounds of their structure into hydrocarbons and other organic compounds that make up crude oil and natural gas. The type of petroleum formed depends largely on the amount of heat and pressure applied to the organic remains. When the temperature is low, which in turn is due to low pressure, a thick substance such as asphalt is formed. While high temperatures produce somewhat thin oil, gas can be produced if heat is applied continuously. But when the temperature reaches more than 500 degrees Fahrenheit, the organic matter is destroyed and the formation of oil and gas is also prevented. Although we humans have always lived in a world that hides its past in the rocks and fossils beneath our feet, we have been blind to the ancient workings of the Earth until very recently. We were isolating enzymes, measuring the distance to the stars, and making tires out of vulcanized rubber before we even had the idea that dinosaurs existed. It happened in 1842, when the British anatomist, Sir Richard Owen, grouped the remains of 3 saurian reptiles into a new tribe that he called dinosaurs. Hence, the myth that oil comes from dinosaurs must be a modern idea. In 1933, the oil company Sinclair sponsored the World's Fair in Chicago on the basis that the world's oil reserves were formed during the Mesozoic era when dinosaurs lived, and the exhibition was so popular that Sinclair immediately adopted the big green dinosaur Brontosaurus, today we call it Apatosaurus, as its official mascot. Even as late as 1964, when geologists and paleontologists began to understand better, Sinclair repeated this idea at the much larger New York World's Fair, and the company insisted that there was a connection between dinosaurs and oil. Today, Sinclair Oil Company has largely gone the way of the dinosaurs themselves. The company has been acquired, and its divisions have spun off several times, and there are still a few thousand Sinclair oil stations scattered throughout the American Midwest. However, it has been difficult to getting rid of the hypothesis that oil came from dinosaurs. Politicians, journalists, and even scientists have from time to time repeated the good faith of this myth, which begs the question, where does oil really come from? In fact, it took a long time for oil to develop under the surface of the Earth, and the first step of this development process began between 10 and 600 million years ago, give or take a few years, and during this period many plants and small organisms lived and died, plankton, in vast ancient seas. With the death of these organisms, they sank and settled at the bottom of the sea, mixing with the sand and clay at the bottom. As a result of their death, they began to decompose, and after the decomposition of their organic materials, they settled between the various sedimentary layers devoid of oxygen, and thus the remains of these microorganisms were transformed into carbon-rich compounds. These carbon-rich compounds remained organic materials and continued to mix with the sediments to form fine-grained rocks, or source rocks. This process continued for millions of years, with more and more sedimentary layers and source rocks piling on top of each other. The succession of these layers generates enormous pressure and heat on the layers and rocks beneath them. It is the combination of this heat and pressure that distills carbon-rich compounds suspended in the source rocks into crude oil and natural gas. Once it takes the form of crude oil or natural gas, this material will ooze away from the source rocks and will collect in rocks of greater thickness and porosity, such as limestone or sand, also called reservoir rocks. This is because they preserve crude oil, and the reason for the ability of these rocks to store these materials is due to ground movements, which push layers of impermeable rocks such as marble and granite above them. These ground movements, which helped keep the crude oil and natural gas contained. The internal movements push the rocks up into the fold, which leads to the formation of a fault, where the rocks crack on one side, up or down, as the impermeable rocks push to reach the reservoir rocks. In a way, it comes close to saying that coal rather than oil comes from dinosaurs, but it's still wrong. Most of the world's coal deposits were laid down during the Carboniferous period, about 300 million years ago, which was still a good 75 million years ago. Or until the first dinosaurs evolved. During the Carboniferous period, dense forests and jungles covered the hot, humid land. When the plants and trees in these forests and jungles died, they were buried under layers of sediment, and their unique fibrous chemical composition caused them to cook into solid charcoal instead of liquid oil. There's an important asterisk here, though. It's not impossible that some dinosaurs could have died in conditions that lent themselves to forming fossil fuels. So, theoretically, a tiny percentage of the world's oil, coal, and natural gas reserves could belong to rotting dinosaur corpses, and you just have to keep in mind that the contribution of dinosaurs to our fossil fuel reserves is orders of magnitude less than that of bacteria and plants. In terms of biomass, the total weight of all living organisms that existed on Earth and that bacteria and plants are the real mass.